From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Democrats coalesce around Kamala Harris as the party's nominee in waiting, with endorsements today from the likes of Nancy Pelosi and Senator John Fetterman, and no new challengers for the nomination. Harris meets tomorrow with Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries.
The Harris campaign claims the biggest 24-hour fundraising cycle in presidential history, with $81 million raised since President Biden dropped out.
We're joined this hour by Democratic Congressman Wiley Nickel, who just announced his support for Kamala Harris, and by political analyst Larry Sabato for his take on a whole new presidential race. Thanks for joining us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons. And there have been many endorsements, as already mentioned, Kaylee, for Kamala Harris. Today, some big ones, including Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi. But current House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries had this to say when asked about his endorsement of the vice president.
Vice President Kamala Harris has excited the community. She's excited the House Democratic Caucus, and she's exciting the country. And so I'm looking forward to sitting down with her in person in short order with Leader Schumer, and we'll have more to say about the path forward as soon as that meeting concludes.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's Peggy Collins and Gregory Cordy to get the conversation started here tonight. Thank you both for being with us. Peggy, what's your thought on Hakeem Jeffries? Not a full-throated endorsement, not an endorsement at all. They're going to meet tomorrow, and he'll have a statement. Is there a fear by some Democratic leaders of making this look like a deal or some coronation?
Well, I think it has been stunning how quickly the party has coalesced around Harris. I think more so than people may have expected. So I think they are trying to be conscious of making sure that they feel like the will of the people is being respected, but also that the party doesn't get torn apart in this process when they really only have a few weeks left before the Democratic National Convention kicks off on August 19th. So I think they're trying to balance things.
Yeah, so we have 4 weeks to go when it's going to be the delegates that ultimately decide who the nominee is. And yet we have seen a number of state delegations in the last 24 hours, Gregory, already deciding to throw their support behind Harris. Is she going to be the presumptive nominee before too long?
We have this impromptu primary, right, that just sort of came out of nowhere. And her magic number, as was Biden's, is 1,976 delegates to clinch the nomination. As of the time I walked into this studio, she was at 1,200 and some. So it's snowballing very quickly. By this time tomorrow, we may well be calling her presumptive nominee, Kamala Harris.
We haven't heard from the Obamas. Nancy Pelosi was a big one today, as we already mentioned. Is that the deal closer? And what are they waiting for?
I mean, I covered the Obama administration, the Obama presidency, and he was very careful with these kinds of statements and exactly what he wanted to convey. So yesterday, he wanted the focus to be on Joe Biden, his old running mate, his old vice president, making sure that the world recognized Biden for what he has accomplished. He also is a party elder and doesn't want to maybe be perceived as putting his finger on the scale, but certainly once it's clear that there's no path forward for anybody else but the vice president, you can bet that he'll be out on the campaign trail for her.
Well, Gregory, as you raised the idea that Obama wanted to recognize the president and public servant that Joe Biden has been, it's also worth noting that earlier today, Kamala Harris did have an opportunity to speak to the cameras the first time she was giving remarks in an official event after President Biden's endorsement, and she used the moment to talk about his legacy. Here's what she had to say.
Joe Biden's legacy of accomplishment over the past 3 years is unmatched in modern history. In one term, he has already surpassed the legacy of most presidents who have served 2 terms in office.
So, Peggy, she there talking about what Joe Biden has been able to accomplish over the course of roughly 3.5 years. We should also talk about what Harris's campaign has been able to accomplish in just 24 hours. They say they raised $81 million in the first day. 60% of the 888,000 donors, I believe, were first-time contributors in this cycle. What is the money telling us about the excitement around her candidacy?
Well, it's clear that she's been able to rally some support from the small donors to the big donors. We have a story out on the Bloomberg right now about how a number of people on Wall Street have already come out behind her with not only their support vocally, but also with their pocketbooks, Ray McGuire from Lazard being one of them. I think it's also interesting, though, just to note that one of the most well-read stories on the Bloomberg terminal right now is actually about Trump and what his team is going to do, because when they're looking at the money, 81 million in 24 hours, and also the fact that the party is coalescing around her, the question for Trump is, okay, how are they going to have to change their strategy around voters? Because it is clearly looking like Harris is going to be his challenger now, younger, a woman, and someone who could potentially change the game when it comes to some of these swing states, particularly with minority voters.
Interesting to hear from Glenn Youngkin earlier here, a voice that we turn to get a sense of what the Republican messaging is here, the governor of Virginia. He spoke earlier on Bloomberg TV and radio, had this to say about a Harris candidacy.
I'm a Republican governor, and so I'm seeing it from the other side, but the amount of pressure that his party was placing on him to step aside was enormous, and there has been chaos in the Democratic Party. You really do see Joe Biden faltering on his ability to campaign, so no, not a huge surprise.
Speaking to us at the Farnborough Air Show, Gregory, what does this mean for strategy in the Trump campaign? They'll tell you this is a wash, that Kamala Harris, the same thing as Joe Biden, that this is the same campaign, but his messaging will have to shift here, right?
Yeah, and it's been awfully inconsistent even over the past 24, 48 hours, because the messaging from Republicans was that Joe Biden's too old to be president. He's too old. He's too old. And then all of a sudden, Biden steps aside. They get a younger candidate. And they say, well, we want Biden back, right? They are going to have to make an adjustment in how they deal with a Harris candidacy. They've already started to do it. Even before all of this started, they were running ads telling people that if you vote for Joe Biden, what you're really getting is Kamala Harris. They've portrayed her as someone who is inarticulate, someone who relies on sort of her catch her phrases, her crutch phrases, talking about what is it? I'm blanking on what they are, but you know, she has her own set of positives and negatives and vulnerabilities that they're going to have to adjust to.
Yeah.
Well, as we consider the adjustments Donald Trump may or may not make, it is worth noting he posted on Truth Social this afternoon talking about, quote, dumb as a rock, end quote, Kamala Harris. So that may just give us a sense of what's to come. Peggy, also considering what the Trump campaign still has in its ability to change, he's already selected a vice president in J.D. Vance. Kamala Harris has yet to make that decision. How should we be thinking about the way in which she, if she is on the top of the ticket, is strategizing around who might join her, knowing it's not just Trump, but Trump and Vance she has to counter?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, and one of them is the issue of the economy. We've seen time and time again, this came up while we were in Milwaukee for the RNC convention last week. The economy is one of the number one issues for voters, but also one of the issues where the Trump campaign feels like it has an advantage when it comes to voters. And one of the things that they think J.D. Vance is a strength around, talking to those American workers who feel left behind. So I think her pick for VP will have to take that into consideration. How do they message around the economy and inflation and the cost of living? Immigration is another, and I think the third is the swing states. Can she pull someone in who could help her in one of those key swing states?
So looking at the likes of, say, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, maybe Arizona.
Who would those people be?
A lot of names floating out there. Bloomberg's Peggy Collins and Gregory Cordy, thank you both so much. Now, we also want to point out that earlier today, the Secret Service Director, Kimberly Cheadle, testified before the House Oversight Committee on the heels of the failed assassination attempt on Donald Trump in Pennsylvania. Here's part of her opening statement.
The Secret Service's solemn mission is to protect our nation's leaders. On July 13th, we failed. As a director of the United States Secret Service, I take full responsibility for any security lapse of our agency.
Committee Chair James Comer told Director Cheadle that she should be fired as the director sat through hours of heated testimony from both sides of the aisle today. The ranking member, Jamie Raskin of Maryland, also called for the director's resignation. Another story we want to update that we've been following now for months. Also, Kromasheva, a Russian-American journalist for Radio Free Europe we've told you about, has been convicted of spreading false information about the Russian army. She was convicted Friday and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison, following a secret trial, as we discussed on Friday with her husband Pavel and daughter Bibi. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich separately was also convicted of espionage charges in Russia on Friday and sentenced to 16 years in prison. Coming up, with many high-ranking Democrats falling in line behind a Harris candidacy, we'll talk to Larry Sabato, director of the Center of Politics at the University of Virginia, about what happens next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
She is exactly the person to bring that coalition together. And it's not just bringing it together, which is a very good question. It's also energizing it. A lot of young people and people of color are thinking, I can stay home on the couch here. I don't have to go to the polls. So energize them, unite them, and energize and unite our side, litigate the case, make a strong case for our accomplishments. She's a great candidate at just the right moment.
Democratic pollster Celinda Lake yesterday on Bloomberg speaking to the candidacy of Vice President Kamala Harris. Joining us now, Larry Sabato, director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia, as we add another voice of experience to our conversation. Larry, it's great to have you. This is moving very quickly. I'm struck by the speed with which this coalescing around Kamala Harris is happening. Democrats want to clearly avoid a noisy, contested convention. There are a lot of parallels here as we keep hearing to 1968. Is the party capable of avoiding them?
Well, the problem with the comparison to 1968 is most of the problems came from the outside, whether it was the North Vietnamese, Russians, Chinese defeating the U.S. More or less in the Tet Offensive, or in the case of the convention, having people who wanted to demonstrate the Vietnam War number in the thousands and thousands and simply converge upon the convention. It's the first convention that smelled like tear gas. I hope it doesn't get to that point this year, but it might. It's possible. We're living in a violent era, and politics has been feeding the violence.
Well, certainly we've been talking a lot about political violence in just the last 10 days, because it was only that long ago that we witnessed the attempted assassination on Donald Trump in Pennsylvania, obviously a critical swing state. We've been thinking a lot, Larry, about what went down in not just Pennsylvania, but Milwaukee the last week, considering in the immediate aftermath of that assassination attempt, Donald Trump selected J.D. Vance to be his vice presidential nominee. If we assume that Kamala Harris is going to be the top of the ticket, who would you guess would be joining her on it? What would best serve the map for the Democrats?
Well, you know, I've been around a long time, and I have learned never to guess who these nominees will pick for their VP candidate, because they all want to do something cutesy. And sometimes it falls really flat, you know, Sarah Palin, that kind of thing. I know who she should pick. I'm old-fashioned. I think that you want to have a balanced ticket. So you pick somebody who's not like you, but can appeal to other segments of the party and the population. And this is all about electoral votes. You know, you can talk about anything you want to, but you win when you get 270 electoral votes. So you pick somebody who can win electoral votes. To me, that means Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, that's 19 electoral votes, or Governor Cooper of North Carolina, that's 16 electoral votes, or Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona, that's 11 electoral votes, plus he's already known nationally because of his astronaut career. And there are some others that fit my definition, but those three occur to me immediately.
We actually heard from Shapiro a bit earlier today. Let's listen to what he said and have you respond, Larry. Maybe we don't have that quite ready yet. But we'll continue our conversation with that in mind, Larry. Let me ask you about the timeline when it comes to a running mate. Is it worth it for Kamala Harris to do what Donald Trump did, essentially, and drag this out to Chicago to create the anticipation and interest around a pick?
Well, you can make an argument for that. I think a better argument is after a few days or a week, at most 2 weeks, doing your search, then you go ahead and announce the winner of that search. Don't let it get out of hand. Don't let potential nominees for vice president either develop because of their efforts or develop because of certain factions' efforts. A group of people who will inevitably, since this is Democrats, say, it's my nominee, it's my way or the highway. You want to avoid that. Get people used to the ticket before you actually go into the convention. Make those days count, because Kamala Harris, even though she's been vice president, she's not well defined. People don't follow what a vice president is doing. And so she needs to define herself, and her selection as vice president is going to help define her in a major way.
Larry, I want to return to the conversation we were having around that vice presidential selection being related to the map and who can bring electoral votes. We've been talking a lot about in recent weeks whether we need to consider a wider list, a longer list of swing states like Virginia this election cycle. We actually heard from the governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, earlier today on Bloomberg speaking about that, and this is what he had to say.
I think that Virginia is still in play.
Right.
And what we're seeing, of course, is Virginians are stating that they want strong leadership, not weak leadership.
Yep.
They know that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden led this administration together, and that track record is her track record. And I think that Americans are reflecting the same sentiment.
Yep.
They're ready for strength in the White House, not weakness.
Larry, you're, of course, also speaking to us as a Virginian. Does the lack of President Biden at the top of the ticket take Virginia back off the map?
I wouldn't go that far. And, of course, Governor Youngkin was giving the Republican talking points. But I do think it is possible Virginia will be competitive, even though Kamala Harris is the nominee. Though I would add, Hillary Clinton, who was a very controversial figure for many years, won Virginia by 5 points. And, of course, Joe Biden won it by 10. But recent polls have had it essentially tied when you do the polling average. Any Democratic nominee who can't put Virginia away relatively quickly, that would be, in my mind, September, is going to have problems nationally. I mean, Virginia is now part of the Democratic base. It's not deeply blue. It's light blue. But there's almost no way for Democrats to win without it. Where are they going to get those 13 electoral votes from? I can't find a place. They're going to be lucky to get to 270.
Larry, I want to ask you about strategy here for the Trump campaign. We heard from Chris LaCivita, campaign manager, in an interview with Axios. He said the last thing we're worrying about is laughing Kamala. You can move the chairs on a sinking boat all you want. Doesn't change the result. Can the Trump campaign win if it does not change its approach now?
Well, they have to change their approach, and being insulting is not a good way to go. I lost count of the number of speakers at the Republican convention who mispronounced Kamala Harris's name on purpose. No one, there's no way that was an accident when you had, a dozen people doing it. I guess somebody sent out instructions. That is insulting. And people don't like that. There are a lot of people in this country who have names that aren't easily pronounceable. And they take offense from something like that, too. They're going to have to take her very seriously. For one thing, she's much younger and more vigorous than Biden. The age problem is gone. There are other problems. There are always problems with any candidate. But the Republicans have to do a lot better than that. I understand why they're frustrated. They had been planning and spending millions and millions of dollars preparing to run against Joe Biden. And now the nerve of him to step aside. Did you see where some senior Republican leaders, I think, including the Speaker of the House, want to sue Joe Biden to force him to continue running as the nominee? What does that tell you?
Well, there's also a live conversation in Republican circles about whether or not the 25th Amendment should be invoked, whether if Joe Biden can't continue on as a candidate, should he be able to continue his job as president. Larry Sabato, director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. And still ahead, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle will be here taking a look at the market reaction to Biden's pulling out of the race. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Stocks gained ground today with investors reacting to President Biden's decision to withdraw from the 2024 presidential race. Joining us now to take us through the action is Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, who is with us from New York. So, Abigail, walk us through it.
Well, stocks had a good reaction to President Biden withdrawing from the race. I would say what's really going on, the reason that the S&P 500 had its best day since June 5th, the NASDAQ 100 as well, both of these indexes up more than 1%, is the removal of uncertainty created by the massive pressure of Democrats last week on Joe Biden to step aside. He resisted. And as that happened, we actually saw the VIX, or the uncertainty index, some call it the fear index, I'll call it the uncertainty index, ticking higher at the beginning of last week after the assassination attempt on President Trump, former President Trump, and his resilience. VIX was very low, below a 13 handle. It had a 12 handle, telling you investors not all that concerned. And then as the week progressed, it ticked higher, and particularly as there was lots of speculation Thursday that President Biden might step aside over the weekend, it went all the way to a 17. Now, today, as key Democrats are coming out and backing Kamala Harris, because we, of course, don't have a Harris trade, this VIX has gone back below 15. That's one way of saying that they do like her. Another way that we have to look at Kamala Harris and her election odds, predicted betting odds, have Kamala Harris, VP, at 41% versus Donald Trump at 60%. What's notable about this, last Friday, she was closer to, I think it was 11 or 12%, shot up to 30%. Earlier today, greater than 20% spread. Now it's less than 20%. But I would say it's interesting that we are still waiting for the key endorsement from Senator Schumer, and Minority Leader Jeffries. You have to imagine that there's some horse trading going on behind the scenes, and not to mention the Obamas. Until we see those endorsements, keep an eye on that VIX. It's been a great tell on all of this political volatility.
Fascinating. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, thank you as always for keeping us up to date on things. So we've got a Trump trade, a JD trade, now a Harris trade. Maybe we should have ETFs tracking all of these until the campaign is over. Coming up, Democratic Congressman Wiley Nickel of North Carolina is going to join us here at the table on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I do think she's the best candidate, best prepared candidate at this particular juncture. I think the American people will see that in her, and they will compare her to the alternative.
Democratic Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina speaking about Vice President Kamala Harris earlier today on CNN as the party coalesces around her candidacy for the nomination. Joining us now on Bloomberg TV and radio is another Democrat who endorsed Harris today, Congressman Wiley Nickel of North Carolina, who is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Welcome back to Balance of Power, Congressman. Appreciate you joining us. You add your name to what is now a long list of Democrats who have endorsed Kamala Harris, inclusive of Jim Clyburn, but also of Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, not yet inclusive of your leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries. What's he waiting for?
I mean, it's only been 24 hours, so I think you got to give everybody a little time to space out these endorsements. But, we got to beat Donald Trump. I'm all in to get Kamala Harris over the finish line. She's a terrific candidate. She's going to be a great messenger for the issues that matter for my constituents. And I'm really excited about the energy we're seeing from the Democratic Party right now.
Well, your support is duly noted, Congressman. I just wonder what this range of opinions is in the House at this point. I realize that some folks were very concerned, some of your colleagues, about Joe Biden leaving. They wanted him to stay in the race. But now that he's out, Hakeem Jeffries is, looking forward to this meeting tomorrow with Kamala Harris. What is he going to learn that he doesn't already know? Do your colleagues have other candidates they'd like to see emerge?
I haven't heard of any. The names that you've heard have all endorsed Vice President Harris.
They sure have.
I think if anything, you're probably just seeing a good communication strategy of putting out endorsements at different times so folks can get some attention.
Well, as you say, the names that we've heard have endorsed her. That hasn't necessarily closed the door, though, to them joining her on the ticket if she's the presidential nominee. Another name that has been on the short list is the governor of your state, Roy Cooper. Would that be a smart selection?
I'm biased as a North Carolinian, but I think it would be absolutely the best choice for Vice President Harris. Governor Roy Cooper, North Carolina. The road to the White House runs through North Carolina. If Trump loses North Carolina, he has no path to the White House. Incredibly popular swing state governor. He's won 2 times in North Carolina on the same ballot that's elected Donald Trump. Very few people can say that. I'm a huge fan, and am very hopeful that we'll see a Harris-Cooper ticket.
Okay, and you think he can bring the state? Because Joe Biden was trailing Donald Trump in North Carolina. How does Kamala Harris stack up?
Well, I think right now we're just at a total reset.
Yeah.
But bringing Roy Cooper onto the ticket would move North Carolina even more into our column. It's the state that Trump won by the smallest amount in the last election, just 1.5 points. I think we are 1.5 points more towards the center in the next 4 years. Over the last 4 years, you add Roy Cooper to that, it's real bad news for Donald Trump and his allies.
Well, as we consider here the decisions that Kamala Harris still has to make, it's not just selecting a running mate, assuming that she will be the nominee, but she also has to decide how she's going to define herself or differentiate herself from a policy perspective from President Biden, whom she has served as vice president for the last 3.5 years. When it comes to some of the policies that you care about, crypto, for example, we talk to you about with frequency. Would you expect her to differ from the Biden administration? For example, would you think that she would allow Gary Gensler to continue on as chair of the SEC?
That's obviously an important issue to me. I fought so hard to get 71 Democrats to join with my Republican colleagues on Fit 21, the first time we've ever voted on crypto legislation. And I'm really hopeful that we're going to see a little bit of a reset from Vice President Harris. I'm working behind the scenes to encourage them to embrace digital innovation, to keep those jobs here in the United States. So I'm hopeful that we'll see, some good comments come out of this new campaign, because she is running in her own right, and that's an issue I think that really matters, especially because we're seeing Donald Trump going to Tennessee on Saturday to give a major speech on crypto. We can't let this be a partisan issue. It's got to stay in that bipartisan category.
Kamala Harris has been a proponent of decriminalizing, if not actually legalizing, cannabis as well, and has been an advocate for that issue. Pulled back seemingly a bit by Joe Biden from the stand that she took on the campaign trail in 2019. If elected, will she be the president to legalize marijuana?
That's one I haven't followed. But, I know in most of the country it's a very bipartisan and popular issue to decriminalize marijuana. And especially when we're talking about medical marijuana, I think that's friendly ground for folks on the federal level. Certainly, I can speak to that from
it's
personal
a mobilizing
experience.
issue for a lot of young Democrats.
It's a big deal.
A lot of bold ones too.
It's a big deal, and if you want to get into why I care about it, my dad died of cancer. He used marijuana illegally at the time in his final days. Everybody ought to have that right. So I think that's one that is a very bipartisan issue. I'd imagine, we'll hear a lot about what she wants to do in her own right. Maybe that'll be one that makes the list.
Yeah.
Of course, a lot of this will come down to Congress as well, as could be the case with crypto and the Fit 21 bill that you mentioned. I'd also like to ask you about what this Congress still could accomplish with Joe Biden, who has effectively, as of yesterday, made himself a lame duck president starting now. Do you see more opportunity for him to have further legislative accomplishments over the course of the next several months, or at least through the remainder of what will be his only term in the Oval Office?
He's said it himself. He is going to put everything he's got behind the next 6 months in office. He's going to be working to run through the tape at the end of December. So I'm really hopeful that we're going to get some things done. That lame duck session, after the election, we're back in November and December. That's one that, depending on the election outcome, could be really productive. I'm focusing on moving a lot of bills. I think if you see a situation where we don't quite get the Senate, and we get the House, with a Harris Cooper administration, we get a lot done in a situation like that.
Would you work for a Harris Cooper administration? I heard your dance card might be open after June.
I'm focusing on our Senate race in 2 years. We've got an open Senate seat coming up, and that's my focus. But I think it's just an exciting time. We got to get through this election first, though. That's the main goal. Is making a big case, talking about what matters. And for folks who care about the economy and business, I just want to remind them of one thing. Yeah. Donald Trump's 4 years in office were chaos, confusion. It was a dumpster fire. It was a constant fear of what crazy stuff's going to happen. I hope folks remember that when they look at this election, because the last 4 years have been, we've had bipartisan accomplishments. We've had an administration focused on doing the right thing. It has not been anything you could describe as a dumpster fire.
Well, you mentioned the economy a moment ago, Congressman. Knowing that you sit on the Financial Services Committee, you know this well. The economy and the data that we're getting about it is mismatched right now with voter sentiment around it and with the administration's handling of it. Can Kamala Harris change that narrative? Because she is attached to this administration.
I think, like anything, it's a reset. It's a fresh opportunity to talk about the good things that they've done, but the work we need to do on, investing in U.S. manufacturing, making sure we're doing everything we can to, to help middle-class families. That's what we're going to see at play here with the competing visions. Trump, focused on, tax cuts for billionaires. He wants his trade policies would bring us into recession, is what the economists say. Compare that with a focus on middle-class families from the Harris campaign. I think that's going to be something that sells in this election.
Thanks for coming in, Congressman. It's good to see you. With visions of a Harris-Cooper ticket, Democratic Congressman Wiley Nickel of North Carolina. Great to have you back with us on Balance of Power. Coming up, Vice President Harris kicking off her bid for the nomination here that we will now play to the panel. Rick and Jeannie are with us up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
She changes the entire equation. She brings young women to the table who had no interest in voting for Joe Biden and were not attracted to Donald Trump. She brings African Americans who are completely disinterested in this campaign. And these matter in states across the country. Now that it's Harris, everything changes, and I can't call it.
The view of Frank Luntz, founder, president, FIL, pollster, of course. Frank Luntz setting the scene here for what this whole shakeup with the Democrats means for this presidential election as we now assemble our political panel. Rick Davis is with us, partner at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Great to have you both here. Our signature panel in place. Jeannie, is Frank Luntz right?
He is right that this changes everything. It is a new day for Democrats, as you can say. I don't know if he is right about her ability to bring along black voters or young women and women in general. That's something we're going to have to wait and see, because quite frankly, what little drip we're getting of polling so far is really premature. So we may not know that yet. I would take a wait and see view on that, but it does change the equation. It certainly opens up the prospect that Democrats, for instance, can flip the narrative as it pertains to age. No longer can Donald Trump talk about how enfeebled Joe Biden is. He now will be the target of those kinds of attacks. So it is a new world. We're just hoping, if you're a Democrat, they are hoping that it is a brighter world than the one that they were viewing over the last 3 weeks.
Well, if you follow the money, Rick, you may have reason to believe that the world is indeed brighter, as the Team Harris campaign says that in the first 24 hours, they raised $81 million. 60% of the more than 880,000 donations they received were people donating for the first time this cycle. What does that tell you?
Well, that's the really best news, is first-time donations, because then you create a pipeline of future donations as people get more and more excited about your candidacy. And look, this is what everybody thought might happen if the president ever stepped down as a candidate, and regardless of who was going to be the ultimate nominee. And so I think all those people, like myself, who were predicting to reset the race, we can feel good about that, at least from the financial point of view. Jeannie's right. I think it's too early to tell. We shouldn't even be polling right now because there's so much disruption in this campaign. It makes no sense to look inside until some of that is settled out. But and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Sounds like Hollywood got on the program. No more George Clooney upsetting people. They wrote big checks. And so my understanding is super PACs are flush with hundreds of millions of dollars that they've received also overnight, which actually has a significant impact on the campaign. So we're off to the races. This is a different campaign now than it was 2 days ago. And like Frank Luntz said, nobody has any clue how this is going to shake out until these campaigns start to really go after one another.
You know what it's like to vet presidential candidates, potential candidates, with very little time and to roll them out very quickly. How much time do Democrats reasonably have here, and what's going on behind the scenes as the background checks start to fly?
Yeah, take your time. Lesson of Rick Davis. Yeah, look, I mean, there are certain perfunctory things you just got to do. And so they've got a list, and they're running them through all kinds of checks. I mean, some of it is as easy as a Google search, and some of it is hard as an FBI review. And an FBI is actually not a speedy organization. They take their time to get it right. And so my guess is that will be part of the delay process, right? You can't just do something overnight and expect to defend your vetting process. The other thing is they're polling these folks, right? So everybody who's on their short list, and they start with a short list, they don't have enough time to do anything other than that, are currently being polled. You know, what are their numbers looking like in targeted states? How do they appeal to the base vote versus the swing vote? So all those analyses also go side by side with the harder core background check.
It's worth pointing out that Kamala Harris, as we speak, is in Delaware at what is now Harris HQ. It was Biden HQ. Right now, Julie Chavez Rodriguez, the former campaign manager for the Biden 2024 campaign, is speaking. We expect that the vice president will come up to the podium any minute, Jeannie. Knowing that we have not yet heard spoken words from Joe Biden about his stepping down an endorsement of Kamala Harris, can she get in front of him here with these remarks? What does she need to say?
You know, I think she is going to keep to the script we heard earlier. I think she's going to, thank the president for the trust he has given in her, for his service. I think she is going to importantly thank that staff. I mean, I just can't stop thinking about the campaign folks, the folks at the White House, some of whom apparently only had a minute to digest the information that he was officially going to be out before it went public. So this is a big deal for them. I also am curious, though, to see, does she make any big announcement? I don't suspect today is the day, but is there going to be any change in the campaign? Who's at the top of this campaign? Rick talked earlier about maybe they move headquarters, right? So there's an awful lot. I don't suspect we hear that today until, to your point, Kayleigh, we hear more from President Biden, or we hear from President Biden. And I'm hoping that that is sooner rather than later. We understand that he is not feeling well, but I'm hoping that that is tomorrow or Wednesday at the latest.
Kayleigh points out President Biden has called into this campaign event for Kamala Harris. I don't know if we can get an ear on that, but that would be a fascinating moment here. That call may have already wrapped up. Well, we're getting an answer to that. We can go to that now. Let's listen live. Joe Biden on the line at a Kamala Harris campaign event. Let's listen.
Great. I think we made the right decision. I know how hard you've worked, how many sacrifices you've made. And so many of you uprooted your lives for me, and the kind of commitment few people make for anything these days, but you made it. And I've been honored and humbled. I mean, this is from the bottom of my heart. My word is a Biden, that for all you've done for me and my family. And we built the best campaign in organization in history. I've been doing this, I always kid and say, I know I'm only 40, but I've been around a long time. I don't know of a better campaign organization, grassroots campaign. We have over 230 offices opened. We have over 2,000 paid staff, and we have literally several thousand volunteers on a regular basis, thousands of them. And they've been relentless and tireless in reaching out and contacting voters. The leadership of this campaign has been amazing. Jen O'Malley Dillon, Julie Quinn, Michael Tyler, Rob Flaherty, Rufus on raising money, and so many more. You built this team. You brought them together. You brought us together. You've inspired them, and you've done what leaders do. Now we got to, the name has changed at the top of the ticket, but the mission hasn't changed at all. And by the way, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be out there in the campaign with her, with Kamala. I'm going to be working like hell, both as a sitting president, getting legislation passed, as well as in campaigning. What we still need to save this democracy. And Trump is still a danger to the community. He's a danger to the nation. And just ask my foreign policy colleagues, my counterparts, and other people around the world and at home. Look, so I'm hoping you'll give every bit of your heart and soul that you gave to me to Kamala. And I want you to know, I won't be on the ticket, but I'm still going to be fully engaged. I've got 6 months left in my presidency. I'm determined to get as much done as I possibly can, both foreign policy and domestic policy. Keep lowering costs for families, continue to speak out on guns and child care, elder care, prescription drugs, and climate. Climate still is the existential threat that we face, and if we don't win this thing, it's all in jeopardy. And we got to keep working for an end to the war in Gaza. I've been working very closely with the Israelis and with the Palestinians to try to work out how we can get the Gaza war to end and Middle East peace and get all those hostages home. I think we're on the verge of being able to do that. And we got to keep our alliances together. It's critically important. It took a while for me to build these alliances. Most of my colleagues have acknowledged that, but it's critically important for our safety and security. And I know I'll be doing whatever Kamala wants me or needs me to do in addition. So let me be real clear. We're still fighting in this fight together. I'm not going anywhere. And I want you to know you've always had my back. And I promise you, I will always have your back. And I'm anxious for you all to hear from Kamala. So thank you, Julie. You're the best.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. President.
Thank you. I'm sticking around. I'm going to listen.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. President, again, for taking time to join our call today. And, as the president said, we are full steam ahead in supporting the vice president, and we are seeing incredible enthusiasm already from our supporters, from Democratic governors to senators to House members to mayors. To
Julia Chavez Rodriguez speaking at the podium there after having Joe Biden call into this campaign event in Delaware for Kamala Harris. If you're with us on Bloomberg Radio, that was a telephone call. Everyone stopped to listen to a Joe Biden who sounded to be in better shape than we've heard in the last couple of weeks. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kayleigh Lyons. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're spending time with our panel here. And Kayleigh, it sounded like a different Joe Biden than we heard in the interviews. It certainly sounded like a different Joe Biden than we saw in the debate. And this is a very important moment, realizing he may speak to the American people. I think that remains the plan from the White House. This is really the first time he has spoken about passing the baton.
Yeah, and when he did so, he said that Kamala Harris should be embraced. He called her the best. He also emphasized that he's not going anywhere. He talked about still being engaged, for example, in the peace process in the Middle East. He said he thinks that we're on the verge of ending the war in Gaza. He also noted that even though he won't be on the ticket, he will be fully engaged and will be on the campaign with Harris. So he may not be the Democratic nominee, but that doesn't mean that we've heard the last from
Joe Biden
in this
Friday.
cycle.
Remember, we reported that he was going to be back on the campaign trail coming up this week, and we asked whether it would be for himself or for Kamala Harris. And I guess we just got an answer.
Yeah, so let's get Rick and Jeannie back into the conversation now. Jeannie, obviously we just heard Biden pledge there that effectively he's not going anywhere, suggesting he's going to be by Kamala Harris's side throughout the remainder of the campaign. Is that good for her, though, or should she be trying to create some distance between herself and an unpopular incumbent president?
You know, I have to say it was a little emotional for me to hear his voice and to think about the service he has given for half a century to this country and to have to step down from the from the race for the presidency, the reelection. I just can't imagine what a personal toll this has taken on him. And I think it is important for him to stay engaged in the campaign, albeit with her now at the top of the ticket. I am never a fan of people distancing themselves from either a president who is not as popular as they wish they were or a predecessor who's not as popular. We all know she was and is Joe Biden's vice president. She is her own woman, and she will prove that on the campaign trail. But I think any support he and the team can give her will be welcome. I don't think people are going to confuse what might be a Kamala Harris presidency for a Joe Biden presidency, as much as, of course, the Republicans, and Donald Trump try to conflate the two and make this inane argument that she's been running the show the whole time.
Joe Biden saying to campaign staffers on the phone, hoping you give every bit of your heart and soul to Kamala that you were giving to me. Smart move, Rick, to call in?
Yeah. So, part of the transition, a lot of this is very symbolic, the handing off of the candidacy.
Is there any point in talking from the White House this week at this point?
Look, I mean, he sounded pretty good on the phone just now, so maybe he's working up a plan to, once things settle down, she gets out on her own to start campaigning to address it. But it's kind of the nature of this whole month. Since the debate performance, he would do things like hold a short press conference and then say, I'm going to give a bigger press conference later today. I mean, none of it really makes much sense from a psychological point of view or even a press management point of view. But look, I mean, he's dealing with a lot of demons right now. I mean, I can't even imagine the challenge that he's had to go through to get to this point to admit that he needed to withdraw from the campaign to give the Democrats a chance to win. That's a mega event.
There we have Kamala Harris at the podium now, for those of you with us on Bloomberg TV, with a rousing round of applause, I should say. We'll be listening to her comments for you with much more on the terminal and online. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you for your insights and analysis on another important day in politics. And keep up with what's happening. This story is moving fast. On the Washington Edition newsletter, you can find it on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us here on Balance of Power. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and Radio.